Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Hospitality Marketing, the live show, number 342. I am your host, Lauren Gray, and I had a whole other project that I was going to lay out today for our live show. And basically, usurped and put on a shelf because our world, as I've titled today's show, has changed yet again. We're certainly not going to politicize or talk about world politics and governments and what have you, but we are going to talk about the ramifications and our need for responding in our business world to the circumstances that are unfolding in front of us on a daily basis in the news. As we are all aware of, political turmoil has erupted again. And there has been some leniencies, got to look up that word, as to the impact from a global perspective. We've seen in the news a variety of accounts of what's going on, especially when it comes to Europe and the diversification that it's creating, the division that it's creating in the world as we know it today. But really, to focus, that's for other people to pontificate about and talk about. But today's show is a lot about what does it do to us as an industry, as a business, our business in particular, our uniqueness of our business, and what ramifications should we consider, and what should we do to adjust for ourselves, that dynamic flexibility that we should have in relationship to our strategies and our business operations. Um, in no small order, there is nobody that is not affected by this. It creates ripple effects, whether you call it the chaos theory or impact analysis or what have you. Truly, the fluttering of a butterfly's wings, for those who are familiar with the chaos theory, do create or at least influence the hurricane on the other side of the world. Um, we do know that there's going to be certain things that are going to be happening that we need to adjust for. First off, let me put the premise of what today's show is going to be directed towards, and that is what do we do about the current changing landscape, the impacts to us, and how do we adjust for things? We're going to talk about defining targeted demographics, and we're going to talk about the realizations that we need to compensate for. Now, for all of you that have followed the show faithfully, thank you so very much. We've gone through a lot of discussions from creating dynamic ads to flexible marketing campaigns, how to evaluate performance in campaigns to adjust very quickly as to the success ratios of what we do, the results of it, the return on investments, the value proposition, the metrics, the KPI. We've had really a fun, great, and I think relatively in-depth discussions about this. And I say relatively in-depth because I get paid to do those things. So the show is more a reflection of what the value of it is rather than the necessary semantics of getting it done. Um, and today is no exception. The reality is this: I this put in this context. I wasn't planning on going to the Ukraine now, or even the imminent future. It's not that I wouldn't find it very interesting. I've actually watched lots of videos created about tourism in the Ukraine, and there's some as with places all around the world, beautiful and stunning places to go to. It isn't about the Ukraine and its impact on hospitality from the perspective of it being a destination and its relevancy to people's choices. It's the impact of what's happening to it to all the other things that it creates an effect for. You're saying, well, I'm not planning on going to Europe or I'm not running a business in Europe. And I know I talked to a lot of my European friends, and we want to talk a little bit about the immediate impacts there for you as well. But one thing's, let's look at commonalities. Commonality is it's going to impact financial markets and in turn also cost metrics. We're not in a perfect storm. That's being over dramatic. We're in a unique circumstance of several influencing factors on our industry. We know that there's supply chain logistics that are still broken. Um, there is a polarization of world economies. So supply sources for things are not the same. There's a scaling up of some other things, which means business growth. And that we answer as a hospitality industry in servicing that with our L&R rates and our negotiated contracts with businesses and corporate travel and what have you, which we've been so desperate in trying to get back. It changes and impacts those things because as countries begin to realign their internal capabilities, that means that there are factories that are coming back alive or factories that are being built, manufacturing, and those things just don't spring up overnight. People have to do research and development, and there has to be a lot of back and forth travel requirements of people that are engaged in that decision process. And we, as hoteliers and as restaurateurs and all hospitality, need to look at how that affects our demand to market. Uniquely, a lot of our markets that were relatively dormant um, might come back to life because they offer an opportunity of development that would be affordable development for companies that are looking to find a place that says, "Wow, where can we find affordable manufacturing space?" And all of a sudden, your quiet little town or area that you thought was on the decline or not as front and center now has a different value proposition. So there's those long-term larger impacts that we're seeing through the economies, but there's also eminently short-term things that are happening. And that is gas is going up. And when you add that to other dynamics, as in the cost of living is going up, inflation, and when you add to the dynamics the persistent in the news discussion about rents, the cost of housing, buying a house, that they're at all record highs, the percentage growth of rent. I mean, firsthand, me here in Southwest Florida, the growth of rentals in here in the past, in the sense of cost of rentals, up 30% in some markets. And there's horror stories worse than that. But for it to be an average of 30%, means there has to be a lot higher and there has to be some lower. But in all average, there's that. So that's a pretty amazing substantive growth of costs to people. What happens, as we know, is that those impacts on people's finances determine their leisure time, their distance to leisure time, their time spent on leisure time. Um, it changes their perspective of that. And then in travel, that cost factor is then also conveyed on means of travel, airlines, fuel costs, the cost of labor. As we have seen in the news, quite honestly, for many months now, we've referred to as the Great Resignation, or what have you. We have a lot of people that are career shifting. They're not staying with their jobs that they had that were either taken away from them due to the pandemic and or that they've decided not to go back to even though they're now available. Hospitality, us, we've had some very lively discussions and topics about that on our labor forces as well. So you have people that are working, and let's just look at the reality of life. If you start a new job, you're not most likely to take an immediate vacation. So a lot of people that are going back into the workforce right now, logistically, are not looking at immediate vacations. They're looking at kind of a delayed gratification. They have to get settled into the new job before they can begin to take a vacation to that. Plus, when you add the extra expenses of what's going on with inflation, fuel, cost of living, places to live, and so forth, the likelihood of having the financial security to travel, even if there was no stress or worry about it, has been exacerbated. Now, when you add the political instability issues, now you've changed it to the interest in travel. Like, do I really want to go do that? And then you add the little overlay of pandemic, which is like, do I really want to get caught somewhere else where it bursts out and spreads out? And now I'm in an area that I now have to go through quarantining and or I get stuck if you're traveling abroad in a country that has different border requirements. So a lot of that uncertainty principle, and we've had stories we've talked about where people, the logistics of them having to organize their travel plans and the things they had to go through. Now we see things that are changing in the sense that reducing of restrictions and so forth. Whether we agree with them being too soon or too late is not the point. The fact of it is, it's a changing landscape. These things are affecting it. So I've laid out all the variables to a degree of the influencing factors of travel. Um, the reality is it's going to impact our demand to our hotels, our frequency of our restaurant usages, and the value of what we can charge for. Because we also, as an industry, as a business operator, have the same influencing factors associated with our cost of operations. Our labor cost has gone up because of the need to increase what we used to pay historically. We either underpaid what we should have paid, or we yielded too much in other ways and didn't put it into labor. Whatever it is, that cost is going up. Our cost of goods is going up. Any sort of financing requirements are going up. We know that interest rates are going up as they try to curb the inflationary aspect of our currencies. Um, we have the cost of operations for heating oil and so forth for those that are in the markets that need that kind of fuel has gone up. And so we have to say, well, where are we going to make that money from? And there's only two things that happen with this. It reduces our margins, specifically profitability, or might exceed them, which creates a negative balance sheet. Or we raise our costs to the customers that are coming to us, which means we're exacerbating the very problem that's creating the problem for us. So now we're having guests that are facing higher rates by us, higher fuel costs to get to us, regardless of the mode of transportation, higher cost of commodities for them to travel, the food, the restaurants, and everything else that's dealing with it, and their own personal costs of cost of living before they even take the opportunity to travel. So it's not a gloom and doom, but these are just the realities of it. We have to be flexible and adaptive. So I promise you that we go through solution processes with this. So here, that's just, and I'm sure there's more. I mean, I'm guaranteed there's more influencing factors than what I'm mentioning, but these are the influencing factors on what we're doing. So here you are, you're in your exec group, and you're discussing modalities. You're looking at revenue yield, you're looking at occupancies upcoming, you're looking at your ADRs, you're looking at your comp sets, you're looking at the lay of your land financially. Okay. What rates are we getting? What's our demand to market for this? What's driving demand to market? Are event driven, business cycle, weather, groups, consortia? I mean, if anything, I was going to mention that 2022 is the year of the reunion. In all honesty, if you have any history with any organizations from your college or high school or family or anything like that, you find that 2022 has been kind of a burgeoning year for we should get together. Kind of that, wow, it's been a few years, and the past few years have reminded us how we need to be connected more. Let's get a reunion. So, there's those bright spots. It was like people are willing to do that. Like, wow, I haven't seen these people in next years. I want to go over and see them. So, your exec committee, you're sitting there, you're trying to decide what you're going to do. You have your P&L, and you also have your operational ledger as to what you're doing, your book work, and you're seeing your costs go up, and you're having to make decisions of deferral of we don't go for the new furniture right now. We don't do the FF&E improvements. Our capital expense margin that we allotted ourselves, we're holding for now. We're not going to spend it off. We're not going to bleed it off, but we're not going to exercise it right now. And you make those choices. Then it's like, okay, our ADR and our occupancy demand, we are at market, meaning we're getting 100% of fair share, but it's because we've had to adjust our rate because the demand has been tapering off, perhaps, or demand is high and we're able to yield on ADR. But the value of knowing who's coming in has turned critically important. The demography of who we're getting and why they're traveling is very important to understand. Now, we have other perfect storm, not perfect storm, other convalescing factors like privacy issues and privacy requirements, and a high focus, as duly needed, on our individual security as to our data that's being used and what it's being used for. We have, the can spam laws, but that started it, and then the GDPR and CCPA and everything else that is about how do we mitigate the data that we collect for our guests from our guests, and what do we use it for, and who has access to it. And in that way, we have to make sure that we don't exploit and push too hard our usages of the permissions of the data that we have. We've mentioned many times on the show the realization that the data is not ours; it's ours to use by permission. That it's by the blessing and the permission of the person that we can understand the data from them as to their demographics. So, from a marketing perspective, we have to first break it down into its components. We have to ask the five questions: who, what, where, when, how, and what, and what. So, who is the big question? Who is traveling? Now, you might look at a particular slice of a day and go, "This is not unique. This is, you know, somebody came off the interstate that night, or somebody's flying through on way of someplace else, and so forth." And it may seem innocuous, but it's actually uh, important because those points of data are in and of themselves maybe not consequential, but in addition to all the points of data that are inconsequential individually, cumulatively they show trend. Cumulative, they show some indication as to a commonality to this. And we're not talking about massive rocket science here. We're not talking about huge softwares and deep analytics and everything else. We're talking about sometimes face value, common sense, looking at it. Wow, look at there's a lot of people coming from this geographic area. By just looking at the geographic area of your arrivals or your historicals. Now, as with any dynamic change in our world, such as what we've experienced this week, there's a bit of a reset as to what is considered default baseline. Prior to the event would be baseline. During the transition would be the variable, and post transition would be the modified. So you have what was being done for you for business prior to the event, to this week's events, let's say. Then you have what happened during this event. Did you get cancellations? Did you get a pause, a decline in demand? Did you get a shift in demand? Did you get a change in people coming in? Source of bookings? Did you get a push for bookings? And I can explain a little bit of that as well. Um, and then now, starting next week, as this begins to become a part of our daily lives, what is the trend of those things? So I'd say we have to first identify the things that are most important to us. So knowing that we're in a point of potential transition, we don't know it's for certain. There are going to be impacts to all of this. Gas prices being the most eminent of our discussions when it comes to variables. Is okay. Let's watch who we're getting in and who we're losing that was planning on coming in. Just being aware of watching is a huge first step. And for to do that well, you have to create points of information that you find relevant to understanding this. Maybe it's the geography that they're traveling from. Maybe it's the price they're willing to pay. Maybe it's the composition of the people coming. Is it families? Is it individual travel? uh, Purpose of travel. Now, obviously, you're not asking every person at their front desk, why are you here? It'd be fun. And sometimes conversationally, it's great, but you're not going to get well, that's not true. You would have to get a very large sample size of all of your arrivals to have some sense of what the general consensus of your arrivals was for. You have to have what's called statistical relevance. Usually that's above 85%. um, if you get, well, excuse me, 85% for validation. You can have sample sizes that are indicative if you have a proper number of numbers. So if you have 1,000 people that are staying with you and you interviewed 100 people, you could imply with a 10% sample what the 1,000 people did if you randomize your sample set. If you just didn't pick every blonde haired tall dude that walked in, but you instead asked everybody in a variety of ways the same question, you sample sized 100 people compared to the 1,000 that eventually came to your hotel, that sample impact would be relevant to the cause. If you skewed it by being identified that tall blonde haired people you're talking to, then you have to refer to the fact that of the 100 tall blonde haired people that walked in, they answered this question. So all the other blonde haired people that we didn't talk to are probably 85% or more confident that they were doing the same thing. That's an inference, but you have to make sure you segment out that data. Sorry, went down a tangent rabbit hole for that. So, with the idea that you are looking at now, the people that are coming into your market and the demographics of them, and you isolate out the points of data that you find valuable and relevant, the geography in which they're coming from, the scale or the type of traveler that they are, independent family, transient, business oriented, uh, smurf business, whatever it is, identifying the segments of the data of the people that are coming in, then you can begin to decide, are they influenced by what you're doing for marketing, or is marketing not talking to them? And that's the first fundamental question you have to have of your marketing strategy. Of the people that I'm seeing, is it because of what I was saying before, what's currently happening now? And am I communicating the information that these people used to having made the purchase decision? Let me give you a case example. If you really, really, really were pushing your tulip festival that you're having in town, and you really put a lot of content to it and a lot of things, and you offered a special and you were doing all your advertisement of a book for staying at the tulip festival and so forth, but you sample everybody coming to your hotel and they really didn't come for the tulip festival, two things happen. One, your marketing was not, um, it didn't succeed because you didn't see the result of it. Okay, that's number one. And number two is that why did you not know why these people were traveling and focus more on identifying more of them? Because as you see one walking your door, there's probably 10 behind that didn't. So whenever you find people coming to your hotel that you don't feel relates to your marketing efforts, You have to ask, what did we miss? And going back now, knowing that they came to you, if there's enough of them, what was the driving forces of it? What was the reason why they came, and how could we have augmented that in our efforts? How could we have gotten in front of them with more information to maybe expand on those demographics? Because these people found us in spite of our lack of effort. How much more could we have gotten had we applied it? And there's a caveat to that as well. Sometimes you get what you get, and it's all that you get, and you couldn't have gotten more. That even if you focused on them, there wasn't more of them. You literally got them because you were the best solution for what they were traveling for, and they found you because of that. And it wasn't because you were smart enough to be in front of them and expand on it. You literally were just the fortunate one that benefited from their needs and interests coming to your market. So there is just the fact that you can't always amplify every market segment, but most of the times you can, which is the reason why marketing is so critical to that. So we know gas prices are going up. We know that there's going to be a kind of slight stutter step as to long-term, longer travel plans because uncertainty factors, and that goes to most of my people, friends that are listening to this through the EU. Your influences on travel are going to be much more ever present than the domestic U.S. travel market is, or the Canadian domestic travel market is right now, because your gas prices are already astronomically high. You're already feeling the effects of the dynamics that are happening politically right now, the reduction in fuel availability, the massive cost implications of fuel right now. Fortunately, infrastructure wise, mass transit is available to you, but that mass transit, with the people that would be popularly exercising, it means that there's a higher demand for it. And those costs go up as well. So prices will go up for that as well. Availability of it going, and means of transportation between where you're getting to and where you need to stay create logistics issues. And so there is a new dynamic of how you have to present your product. And this goes to us in the States as well, and Canada and APAC. You're going to be feeling the effects as well. All of us globally are going to be feeling these effects. How do I add additional content to what I'm doing to help people know what they need to know to make the decision to stay with us if we're a hotel or dine with us if we're a restaurant? This goes go back to some of our earlier conversations of creating authoritative value content on our distribution means. If you're a branded hotel, you have very strong limitations as to what you can put on your website. You have modules of content. That's what you have. And it doesn't always change as frequently as you would like it to change. And it doesn't expand as much as you would like to expand it. There's limitations, quantifications, and clarity as to exactly what they expect you to put into these modules. Putting a wedding module together is fine. Talking about group business coming to your hotel is different. It doesn't fit in that template of a wedding. So that those restrictions for you on the website are very defined. So for that reason, you need to look at what avenues of communication you have. Social is the most lateral move one that you can have. Unfortunately, social is more of a temporary platform. Whatever content you put about events, unless you're repetitively placing it in your news feed and the person is willing to go to your place regularly to see it, you have to pay for that exposure, and you're gonna have to make sure there's a frequency of content so that people can go back through the chronological string of data to get the full picture of what you're trying to give in content. It's so much easier to be able to put it on your website. That's the traditional restrictions for social. We now have new channels, and we had some fun conversations with it the week before last. Last week we talked with Eric at last Alice at Lassie. The week before that, I was talking about, and our podcast, we talked a lot about this, about very short, intermediate distribution capabilities, the TikToks of the world, the Instagrams of the world, the Snapchats of the world, the YouTube Shorts of the world. Matter of fact, my last podcast, 341, we went in great detail about these. To be honest with you, it was fun. It was a fun discussion. The idea is we are in a very short-term attention span world, and we have very concise pieces of information that we have to put out there. If your limitation of content is you don't have a website to put this on, or it takes so long from inception to creation to implementation, which sometimes happens with third party agencies, and while the agency doesn't run the website has to go and get approved. There's three people in the chain for approval. It slows it down. You can't just say, here today on Friday, I want this content on my website come Monday. It's great that you can, if that's available to you. Highly recommend you evaluate your content based on your demographics, based on your targeting, based on your change in modality, and get that content out there ahead of everybody else, because you will take advantage of being the first to offer that. Um, Case example, our COVID crash kit. When this is just now recent because Canada changed its border rules and so forth, but a lot of people didn't know the logistics of getting to a city in Vancouver where our client was at, and so we took it upon ourselves of what happens if the test is positive and you're stuck, detained, you can't go across the border, and you're at our hotel, and we put all this content together about what our price structure is. How do you guarantee this? What our meal period offerings are, where they come from, um, any dietary requirements that we can maybe sensitive to. How do we isolate you? How do we clean your room? How do we get things to you? What do you do? Where do you get tests? Can you get tests? Can they be delivered tests? All this data that you didn't think you needed to know because you were just thinking I got to take a test. It goes negative. I go I'm on plane. I go fly home. But what if it isn't? That content was massively popular to the point where it was being used by everybody else in the city. I wouldn't say everybody. That's a dramatic statement, but it was used well beyond our hotel's requirements because we took the time to accumulate the data of where are the testing centers, what are the current rules, what are the links to these rules, what is the information you need to know from the airport, what from the airport, from the airlines, where's the apps that you use, where do you get the food, how do you get food delivered. There was so much data that people just ripped off and added to theirs, and we get the link value for it. It was a huge bone for us in that sense, that we're in that same circumstance right now. It may not be as dramatic in its implications, but the impact of what's currently happening this week and what will continue to the following weeks, okay, will have an influence on what people's decision processes are. Gas being the most easy to poke at because gas affects everybody from airline ticket cost to trains and diesel bringing you product for your operation itself, to the cost of people getting to you, whether they fly or drive. Gas is going to be an influencing factor to that. And it's not whether it's available or not. That's even more dramatic of an impact. Okay. Having been a bitty bitty baby back in the 70s when there was gas lines and no gas to be had, and you ran out of gas, and there was cars on the side of the road that ran out of gas because there was no gas to be had, is a lot more dramatic than we're talking about having to choke and pay for the price of a gallon of gas right now. And it's funny that we think about, oh my gosh, it's gonna be over $4 in the United States. In Europe, it is like 11, 12, $13 a gallon in equality spec. So there is levels of tolerance. So knowing that this is impacting us, the sooner we can redefine the content that we need to put in front of our guests to help them through the process. Because as we said at the beginning of the show, and thanks for noticing there and here, the additions of people joining us, we talked about all the not perfect storm, influencing factors right now. Gas prices being one of them, the instability quotient as to the security of travel, especially abroad, the domestic impact as to the shifting of manufacturing requirements, business development, and growth. Because as countries like the United States, Canada, but pretty much every country is reevaluating their infrastructure as it comes to self sustainability of what they need. I bring out the case in point about the silicon chips. Taiwan, China, so forth. They retooled what they were doing based on demand requirements through the pandemic in the early stages, and now there's a shortage of them for the other domestic stuff that they used to build with them. And that shifting of gears and availability, and that the fact that it was international and that it has to be shipped through, and they're sitting in container boats outside of large harbors, we saw all that in the news. That affected so many things in the process, and it still does. So all of these influencing factors are changing the travel dynamic. We talked about high rents. We talked about hotel home ownerships. We talked about the cost of even availability of getting cars and the overpricing of even used cars. All of those things influence the expendable income that people have, the fact that they are now reemerging and trying new jobs, and their ability to even take vacation time early on in their new job, their willingness to take vacation in their new job. All of these things have influences as to what the dynamic is for upcoming season. Spring break coming up next month, next week for the United States. How is that affecting people's decision processes with gas prices going up? Pandemic is the positive is the pandemic impact right now is at a lower level. A lot of municipalities and governments are releasing a lot of their requirements. Hopefully, that will abate some of the other political things we're seeing, like in Canada, and the possibility of it reflecting the United States and so forth, of people being publicly and verbally pushing back on the mandates that were enforced for a lot of places. By removing the mandates, I think that kind of takes the punch out of a lot of that conversation, which means influencing in lots of ways other things. Those truckers aren't delivering stuff if they're in protest. and that affects the fact that you're missing furniture for your hotel lobby, or food product to your restaurant service, or linens for your housekeeping systems. There's a whole ripple effect to this. We talked about the chaos effect and stuff. And yes, the butterfly does make the difference for the hurricane on the other side of the world. So all of those things have to be in your exec meeting discussions. All of those things have to be available to be understood from your perspective, your unique individual business perspective. How does this affect your business right now? As you look at your star reports, as you look at your spiders reports, as you look at your OTA insight reports and so forth, what is it saying to you? The ADR demand, the occupancy demand, the type of business that you're getting in, the location that they're coming from. How does that affect those aspects? And how do you adjust for your reaction to those aspects? Sometimes things like this, as in all diversities and adversities, there are opportunities that come from it that you didn't anticipate. There's also a lot of challenges that come from it that you didn't anticipate. We've said repetitively over the show, the dynamic budgeting, the dynamic advertising, the flexibility to adjust what you're doing very quickly rather than forensically later with, oh, well, we should have changed that 3 weeks ago, but this is the first time we're looking at it. So, we need to make the change now. We should have done it 3 weeks ago. We should have looked at it sooner or more frequently. That's the world you're in right now. That's the response to what we've lived through these past 2 years. It's the response we have to live going forward. The idea of new normal doesn't exist anymore. This is normal. This is not new. This is now. And from that, we have to look at very quantitative things that make impacts on our decisions, both in operations cost and also in marketing spend. The idea of sitting and waiting and get what comes your way is not a good one. All too many companies and businesses go to it's better for us to pool our money and hold on to it than it is to spend it in the hopes of continuing business demands. Um, Batten down the hatches and wait for the weather to pass. You'll always have your hatches battened down. You'll always be prepared for a storm, and you'll never emerge from it. That is something that we saw a lot of companies that did that early on in the pandemic. They just simply petered out. They ran out of resources they were harboring, and by the time they realized they needed to kind of get out in the open and start trying to generate business, they were so antiquated and they had no good tech stack because they allowed it to sit dormant, and they had no staff because they furloughed them, and they had no modality to do it. They ended up just dying waiting. And that's what happened. A lot of companies that may have started like that and then realized that they had to do something about it, they struggled to get back into alignment to their market and to get the demand that they had from before. And then you had others that realized that this was the time to readjust what they were doing, to reset how they were doing it to the reality of what the world was now and then, and made the changes as the things went forward. They were very flexible and dynamic about their changes, and they were able to ride the storm, as it were. Um, and that's what we're saying here. I am, is that we're in a flux of change, just like I said with the title of the show today. Um, and just like I had a whole nother project of what I was going to do for the show today changed when this happened this week, is the world changed yet again. These impacts are happening to us now. And how long they last is not to be known, but the fact that they exist is the most critical component of our discussion. When you're marketing for these variables right now, you have to assess it on what is known, not on assumption, not on perspective, not on opinion. There's venturing, yes, there's intelligent decision making, and there's risk factors with all of it, and there's uncertainty even on the stuff that you're certain about. But these are all based on quantified confidences. If it's not well, let's try it, see what happens. This is not necessarily a time unless you have the money to burn to do those kind of decisions. Right now is, what do we know? How do we know it? What do we do with it? And what can we do with it? And they may sound similar in questions, but they're very different in their answers. The first question is, what do we know? You have to ask the right questions. What is it we need to know? We need to know where they're coming from, why they're traveling, and whether there's more of them, or we got all the ones that were doing that for that reason. If they're coming for the Tulip Fest, that was for the weekend, it's not like you're going to be able to get them back the following week because there's no Tulip Fest the following week. So known entity happened the way it did, got what we got. Done with that. Now we need to know who else is traveling and why. And that goes to some of my earlier conversations to discussing what's changing in your market. Is there, and this goes because of your relationship with the Chamber of Commerce, the CVB, the TDC, what do they have in the pipe? What is interested in your market? Are there companies like, is Amazon going to build a warehouse next to you? That's going to change your dynamic a lot. Is there a manufacturing firm that's going to come to the market because of taking over a dormant manufacturing facility that's been in your market that used to be there but isn't? Okay. A lot of hotels were built under the relationship that they existed with companies that may no longer be there. And they're left where they are. And if they're still operating as hotels, because they were able to find other demands than the one they were created for. Well, then there's also hotels that are in a wonderful high demand location. Resorts and destination marketing is a little easier in this task, with the caveat being that their affordability is still seen in the perspective of those people willing to come. Going back to the gas discussion, going back to the new job discussion, going back to the cost of living discussion. If all those things have a negative impact on the people that normally went to your destination resort, it's going to have a negative impact on your demand cycle. So, who else can you go for that you think would be worthy of cultivating demand to you to come to you? And that's where the who's traveling conversation comes up. And as I said, in the data collection, you have your baseline, you have your variable, and then you have your expansion. Your baseline is prior to this week's events. Whether they have the full effect that we're talking about or moderate effect, there will be some effect. And does it affect you is the question you have to answer. So you have what you thought was going to happen prior to what was happening this week. Now you have what's happening now this week. Has it changed your future demand, your future ability to push rate, your future events? Are they in question? Um, is there any concern in your market? Just like what COVID was affecting us, when there was events in markets, did your market wonder whether they were going to have that festival or not, um, or whether they were going to have that event or not because of the uncertainty of COVID? Now we have the uncertainty of whether or not there'll be enough attendees. Gas costs being one of the reasons. So from that, you have to determine what's the value proposition. If you look at what you think is demand, now it's up to your marketing team to determine how much demand is out there, how much market is out there for that demand. Let me say that correctly. How many people do we think we can influence with the knowledge of why they might travel to our market with what we have as information? And then you assess, do we have enough information already in play that we can refer to it directly? Or do we have to create content and information that is relevant to the people, like I did my Covert Crash Kit stuff? Then from there, what channels do we do that for based on the criteria of geographies, demographies, cost to get in front of them, channels that they tend to use? Are they more of an email conversation? Are they more of a paid ad conversation, display conversation, short-term social media conversation, long-term media social conversation? What is the channel of discussion that you need to look at as being the most productive for who we've identified? Then you look at the cost to do that. You put that in to your marketing strategy on the platform that you're choosing. Let's just say Facebook is what you're choosing. You put it in the ad campaign, so forth, and Facebook, just like Google, if you pick Google, would tell you what the estimated cost is and how much money you should spend to get to the audience size that you've identified. And that identification can be the geography you have said that this region is where I'm wanting to target myself at. It might be the demography of this type of age group and or income and or family status. And the platforms are very much designed to want you to spend money with them. They're going to tell you what they think you need to spend as money and what it's going to cost you for the type of results you're looking for. And this is the time when you don't get to fool yourself. This is the time that you go over and look at what has been our success on this channel before. If you're just doing an ad but it goes nowhere, you're going to have less of an impact. If you have an ad that drives it to content on your website that expands the conversation topic that was driving them there, then you have a higher conversion value because now you're adding the depth that's necessary to answer the questions so they can get to ZMOD, zero moment of transaction. That goes to whether you're a brand or not branded hotel, whether you have an active or not inactive website, if you have a full website or a partial just brochure website. These are all things you have to be real to yourself with. What do we have as tools? What are our resources? What do we have available to do this with? Um, if you're a fan of the movie The Princess Bride, it was always funny when they were talking to him. It's like, well, we have, as resources, his blade, my strength. And they said, well, if we only had a wheelbarrow, well, what do we do with the wheelbarrow from the albino? it you sometimes don't realize the resources you have unless they're put in the context of whether you could use them. So don't just automatically assume that, well, we do this and this is what we have. What else do we have? What is it that makes this a value proposition to us? What can we offer differently? And this goes to some of the intrinsic things like, okay, if you're getting people to try to come to your hotel and your hotel doesn't have full food and beverage operations, if any at all, what relationships do you have to the restaurants nearby to you? Can you offer something that gives them the value proposition of, well, we may not have food services, but yes, of course, there's always delivery services and so forth to a degree, but we have some really cool restaurants around us, and they've offered value propositions that we can offer to you by staying with us. That the pizza place around the corner will give you 10% off, 15% off, 20% off because you're staying with us. The other place around the other corner, same thing. If you can maybe add that into it, and you may not look at the fact it's like, well, we can't get those people because we don't have a restaurant to bring them to. They're not just going to want to stay with us. They're going to want to be able to eat when they're with us. Answer the question. If that's the resistance, what are your options? How can you present variations to stuff? Because at the end of the day, and we all have done this, it's not like I'm sitting back going, well, the only restaurant I can go to is the one that's in the bottom of my hotel. I shouldn't go anywhere else because, I'm staying at this hotel and I should go to their restaurant. No, the reality is there's capture percentages with your restaurant that usually are breakfast related, especially first breakfast because it's the most convenient and easiest. But as the duration of somebody's stay at your hotel, we all know the capture percentage goes down because they want to begin to increase their circle. They're FOMO, don't missing out. What do you mean the greatest grouper sandwich is right next door and you never told me? I want to go and have that grouper sandwich. Even though I had a grouper sandwich at your restaurant, I want to go to that one that has a grouper sandwich. Knowing this means that you have to add this into your dialogue of content, or in the ways of the Princess Bride, that you have a wheelbarrow, that you don't know the assets that you need until you need the asset. And looking at these varieties of things that you have, it goes back to the core element of who you can get in. What do they need when they come in? What will incentivize them to choose you compared to your comp? And if that's the case, is it rate driven? Is it location driven? Are you in proximity to something? Is there your brand of your type of hotel, your amenities of your hotel? And then those are the core elements you most directly influence. And then the others are, what's the driving forces of their travel? What's the purpose of them traveling? And from all of that, you go into then how can I get the information in front of them? So I know I've kind of beaten the singularity of this conversation to a degree, but I wanted to bring attention via the live show that it, we need to be adaptive. We've talked about adaptation and flexibility in our budgeting and in our marketing. We have to be adaptive in our perceptions of the altering impacts of our demand to our business. We don't know the full negative and or positive effect, the variables associated with the current circumstances in the world today. We can basically plan for the worst, hope for the best, but the reality of it is fuel prices will be affected. Most likely, they're going to be affected negatively, meaning that the prices will go up. We know that reflects a tremendous amount on the demand of travel because of the cost of travel. We add that to the other known factors as to the cost of living that we're all facing, the commodities that are in shorter supply, the cost of those commodities. And we know that those are all cumulative decision values as to whether a family goes on their summer vacation or their spring break getaway for either as long, or they might scale the hotel from being what they were willing to pay to what now they have to pay. Where the cost of fuel has mean that as much as we want to stay at the nicer place, we're going to stay at the more affordable place. It can change your channel shift in your market. All of a sudden, you might find that there's a demand for your type of hotel because of price structure and amenity combinations that were from another place that normally got that business. Like I can stay at the resort for the much higher price potentially, or I can stay at your hotel for the lesser price and do more other things, or even get there. There might be a fact of total affordability. It's like, well, we can't stay at that place because we can't afford to go. So all of these things have to be in your discussions for your committee. All of these things have to be asked in front of everyone because everyone has a vested interest in your individual perspective as a property. Your GM doesn't have a monopoly on the perspective. Your DOS doesn't have a monopoly on the perspective. Your director of marketing doesn't. You should actually ask below your exec level. the impact on supervisors, the impact on your team. This is a great opportunity to be inclusive with your team and say, here's our situation. We need people to come in the door. And we believe these are the reasons why they're coming in the door, but we really want to hear what you hear from the guests that are coming in and what you think. Not all of it's useful. A lot of it is incredibly insightful. And other stuff is, okay, that's kind of reaffirmational as to what I thought. But the idea that you did it makes people feel invested. They feel like you're listening to them rather than them just doing what they're being told. The value that you can get out of this collaboration of interpretation of what the market is like, non-politicized. You're not asking for people's political opinion about this or the validation or the causation or anything else. Just what do we as a business do? Who do we get in the door that's willing to stay with us, that pays us the fee amount that we need to operate, to pay basically payroll, salaries, and the cost of operations. So these are the elements of what the world has changed like. Again, nobody put into their budget plans this year the idea that when case of war in another part of the world breaks out, this is what happens. But we have to be adaptive in the change of demand cycles. And that's the part about our budget that we have to be able to be flexible on. That's the part of our strategies that we have to be flexible on. And we have to be very thoughtful about tracking information that can help us make informed decisions rather than general assumptions. Because a bunch of people showed up in your lobby dressed in suits doesn't mean you're getting back your corporate travel. It just means a bunch of people with suits showed up in your lobby that day. Now, if a company is beginning to book persistently rooms and you look in with your CVB and chamber and find out that they are prospecting the possible development of a manufacturing office in your community again, by all means, let's go over and talk to these people and talk to the organization itself and see how can we create a negotiated rate with them so that we become to capture more of that business persistently compared to other competitors they might be testing the waters with, and you just happen to be one of them. So these are the variations I wish to discuss. We will in the podcast today touch this again. I'm going to do on the podcast a little bit more recurring conversation about demographic profiling, being able to create personas, identifying the metrics and data sources of what you should look at to define these ones. We'll be a little bit more technical about the how-to on that as a response to a little bit of the discussion we had today for the live show. I apologize that we didn't do the topic we're going to do. I'm going to say that we're going to try to put that next week, but I don't want to commit to it because we don't know what between now and then is going to happen. And we might have a whole different reason to talk about something else. So for right now, I thank you all for very much the privilege of your time listening to me today and kind of thinking about just pausing for a moment and thinking about the impact of what's happening right now on our future business cycles and demands and how we might be positively adapting ourselves to making sure that we mitigate the impact on our industry or our business for that as well. So please send me an email, lauren@hospitalitydigitalmarketing.com for any feedback or insights. If you want to join the show as a co-host with me, like I said, we just had Ellis last week from Lassie with Ed from Flip2 joining us as well. We're going to continue to regrow our co-hosts with us as we move forward. We used to have lots of talking heads, and we switched that out a little bit. Thank you, Marcy. I appreciate that. And we look forward to the fact that we'll have more of those as well. So until next week, show 343, I welcome you to watch us on our TV channel, hospitalitychannel.tv. Also to listen to our podcast. We're on 39 different platforms. Just look for the Hospitality Marketing Podcast. We do that in parallel to our live show here. And until next week, next Friday, 11:30 a.m., my name's Lauren, and I thank you for the privilege of your time. You all have a wonderful day. Thank you now. You then turn into a second-class citizen. That's the part that gets me about, and we're on the good side of it. We follow the rules. We stop at stop signs. We do all the stuff we're supposed to do. Imagine getting pulled over and being accused of a crime you didn't commit and then going through the process of all that requires. There's a victimization to this that, innocent that you may be to that. I'm thinking of that in that circumstances that you did what you thought you should have done. And